What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. CNN just got its hands on an internal email that I think is genuinely one of the more chilling documents to leak out of this entire war. A senior CENTCOM intelligence officer sent a message to a broad group of military analysts asking for new, creative, and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran. Let's break down what that actually means, why it landed at exactly this moment, and what it tells you about where Washington's patience actually stands right now. I'll walk through the actual CENTCOM email and what soliciting unconventional ideas signals, then Trump's new compensation demand that just complicated the Hormuz talks I covered in my last two videos, then the operational security crackdown happening alongside all of this, and finish with my take on what creative and unconventional actually tends to mean in a request like this. According to CNN, sourced to two people familiar with the message, an officer in CENTCOM's intelligence branch wrote to a broad group of military analysts, "We are looking for new, creative, and unconventional ways to pressure and punish Iran." A second source confirmed a senior U.S. military officer sent this request last week. I want to be precise about what this actually is. This isn't a public policy statement or a presidential threat. It's an internal solicitation for ideas, sent to people whose job is specifically to generate exactly this kind of analysis. That distinction matters, because it tells you this isn't rhetoric aimed at an audience. It's the actual machinery of war planning actively searching for new options right now, separate from whatever's being said publicly. Coming after everything I've documented across this entire series, 13 consecutive nights of strikes, the Jordan and Kuwait exchanges, the Amazon data center strikes, the Pickaxe Mountain threats, the B-1 and GBU-72 rollout. A request for unconventional pressure suggests the conventional toolkit, precision strikes on command centers, missile sites, coastal facilities, is being treated internally as insufficient on its own. That lines up with something else in this same reporting, retired General Jack Keene's public call for a comprehensive campaign rather than limited retaliatory strikes, including isolating Iran by closing its roads, railways, airports, and ports, and conducting all-out attacks on the IRGC, their leadership. When you put an internal request for unconventional options next to a prominent voice publicly calling for full economic and infrastructure isolation, you get a fairly clear picture of where military thinking is heading. This lands at a genuinely awkward moment given what I covered in my last two videos on the Hormuz negotiations. Trump said Monday he'd require compensation from Iran for past misdeeds as a condition for talks, right after Tehran said U.S. compensation was required to reopen the strait in the first place. Iran has now set an agreement with Oman to manage the strait won't be enough to actually reopen the waterway unless the U.S. meets a broader list of conditions. That's two governments each demanding the other pay compensation first, a genuine standstill that undercuts a lot of the cautious optimism I flagged in my Hormuz talks video. I covered Iran's military reshuffle in my last video, and CNN's own follow-up analysis adds real weight to the concern I raised there. Sina Azodi of George Washington University said Mohsen Rezai's elevation feeds into an Iranian strategy of prolonging the conflict specifically to ensure Trump's political allies face defeat in the midterms. Rezai's own past statements are blunt, warning that if the U.S. strikes Iran's electricity infrastructure, it will be a head, hands, and feet for an eye, and claiming the United States has been trapped, we will not let it go. Vali Nasser's assessment is direct too. This leadership is far more risk-taking than previous Iranian leadership, partly because they view Iran's restrained response to the 2020 Soleimani killing as a mistake that invited more pressure rather than less. One more detail that fits this chilling theme, CENTCOM's Admiral Brad Cooper issued a warning after footage from a service member's smart glasses showing troops running for shelter during the deadly July 17th attack on Jordan's Muwafaq Salti base got posted to Instagram. Cooper warned that photos, videos, and detailed accounts of Iranian strikes could help Tehran assess damage and plan more effective follow-up attacks. CENTCOM says this is about basic operational security, but it's landing alongside genuine concern from military families who rely on exactly these kinds of messages for reassurance during attacks. Another sign of how tightly this war is being managed on the information front, not just the kinetic one. I want to think through what a request like this actually tends to produce, based on how similar language has played out in past American military planning contexts. When intelligence and planning staff get asked for unconventional options against a state adversary, the resulting brainstorm typically spans a genuinely wide range, everything from expanded cyber operations against financial and infrastructure systems, to covert support for internal opposition movements, to economic warfare measures beyond standard sanctions, to information operations aimed at undermining regime credibility with its own population. I want to be careful here. CNN's reporting doesn't specify what ideas actually came back in response to this request, and I'm not going to speculate about classified operational planning I have no visibility into. But the framing itself, pressure and punish rather than purely degrade capability, is worth sitting with. Everything I've documented throughout this series, the strikes on command centers, missile sites, coastal facilities, the bridge campaign, the bunker-busting operations against nuclear infrastructure, falls under a fairly conventional understanding of degrading military capability. A request specifically for unconventional options to punish suggests planners are looking beyond that capability degradation framework entirely, toward measures aimed more directly at cost imposition and behavior change, rather than simply reducing what Iran is physically able to do. That's a meaningful shift in framing, even without knowing the specific ideas that came back in response. I think this email takes on added significance when you place it next to my earlier video on Iran's internal economic collapse, the currency crash, the bizarre strikes, the broader protest movement I documented extensively. If CENTCOM planners are genuinely looking for unconventional pressure points beyond direct military strikes, Iran's own documented internal fragility, an economy already in its worst crisis since the 1979 revolution by the government's own admission, is exactly the kind of vulnerability that unconventional planning would logically consider. Economic and information pressure specifically aimed at exacerbating an adversary's existing internal instability is a well-established category of statecraft, separate from kinetic military operations entirely, and Iran's regime is already managing exactly the kind of internal legitimacy crisis that this type of pressure would be designed to exploit. That's speculative on my part. I want to be clear, I don't have any specific evidence CENTCOM's request was aimed in that particular direction. But given everything I've covered about how stretched Iran's government already is managing simultaneous external war and internal unrest, and given the Kurdish insurgency front I covered in another earlier video, any request for unconventional pressure options would be professionally negligent not to at least consider how those existing internal pressure points might be leveraged further, whether through information operations, economic measures, or other non-kinetic means entirely separate from anything resembling the strikes I've spent most of this series documenting. I mentioned retired General Jack Keene's public comments briefly, but I want to dig into them more because I think they're a useful public proxy for understanding what kind of thinking might be circulating internally, even without direct visibility into CENTCOM's actual planning. Keene specifically called for isolating Iran by closing its roads, railways, airports, and ports, a genuinely comprehensive economic and logistics blockade that goes well beyond the naval blockade of Iranian ports I've already covered in earlier videos. Combined with his call for all-out attacks on the IRGC, their leadership, and his separate push for hitting Iran's ballistic missile and drone capabilities specifically, you get a picture of a fairly comprehensive multi-domain pressure campaign being advocated publicly by someone with real credibility and real access to current military and political thinking. Keene isn't an active duty officer, and his public comments don't necessarily reflect CENTCOM's internal planning directly, but retired flag officers in his position often function as informal messaging conduits, testing ideas publicly that active planners may be considering more quietly. Seeing his specific framing, comprehensive isolation, plus leadership targeting, plus missile and drone infrastructure, land in the same news cycle as CENTCOM's own internal request for unconventional ideas suggests these aren't two unrelated threads. They're likely pointing at the same underlying strategic conversation happening at multiple levels simultaneously right now. I want to spend more time on the dueling compensation demands too, because I don't think this is simply two governments talking past each other by accident. Trump requiring compensation from Iran for past misdeeds as a condition for talks, landing immediately after Iran demanded U.S. compensation as a condition for reopening the strait, reads to me like each side setting a deliberately unacceptable precondition, specifically to avoid being the party that visibly walks away from negotiations. That's a recognizable negotiating pattern, rather than flatly rejecting talks, which carries real political cost domestically for looking unreasonable or escalatory. Each side instead attaches a condition the other side has no realistic path to accepting, achieving the same practical outcome, no near-term deal, while preserving the appearance of remaining open to negotiation. If that read is accurate, it tells you something important about how to interpret the CENTCOM email specifically. A military actively soliciting unconventional pressure options at the same moment its own government is setting up what looks like a deliberately unworkable diplomatic precondition suggests the administration's actual internal expectation is that this standoff continues rather than resolves in the near term, and planners are being told, implicitly or explicitly, to prepare accordingly rather than to stand down in anticipation of an imminent deal. I want to go back to the Admiral Cooper warning about smart glasses footage, because I think there's more to unpack there than a single paragraph captured. The specific incident, footage from a service member's Meta glasses showing troops running for shelter during the July 17th attack on Muwafaq Salti, getting posted to Instagram, represents a genuinely new category of operational security risk that didn't really exist in previous wars at this scale. Wearable, always recording consumer technology means individual service members can inadvertently generate exactly the kind of battle damage assessment footage that Cooper warned Iran could use to determine what it hit and plan more damaging follow-up attacks without any deliberate intent to leak anything, simply through normal personal device use during a stressful, chaotic moment like an actual missile attack. That's a genuinely difficult problem for military leadership to manage, because it's not really about punishing malicious leaks. It's about an entire generation of deployed personnel carrying consumer devices that weren't designed with wartime operational security in mind at all. CENTCOM's spokesperson framed this as a general reminder about the importance of maintaining operational security. But the fact that Cooper personally addressed it, and that CNN characterized this as part of the prospect of a wider crackdown, suggests this is being treated as a more serious, systemic vulnerability than a single isolated incident. I think that's worth connecting back to the broader theme of this entire video. A military command that's simultaneously soliciting unconventional offensive ideas while also tightening defensive information security around its own deployed forces is a military bracing for a longer, more demanding phase of this conflict, not one anticipating an imminent, clean resolution. I covered Rezaei's appointment in my last video on the command reshuffle, but I want to go deeper on why CNN's own reporting frames his elevation as such a significant signal, because I don't think I gave this full justice previously. Rezaei commanded the IRGC for 16 years, including through the entire Iran-Iraq War, which means his formative professional experience is rooted in a conflict where Iran fought a grinding 8-year war of attrition against a better-equipped adversary and, in the view of many analysts, ultimately outlasted that adversary's willingness to continue rather than winning through direct military superiority. That's a genuinely different strategic education than a commander, shaped primarily by more recent, shorter conflicts. And it likely explains why Sina Azodi specifically frames his elevation as feeding into a strategy of prolonging this current conflict, rather than seeking rapid resolution. Rezaei's own past public statements, which I quoted in my last video, the head, hands, and feet for an eye threat regarding electricity infrastructure strikes, and his claim that America has fallen into the trap of Iran, both reflect a genuinely more confrontational rhetorical posture than what came from Iran's leadership earlier in this war. Fali Nasser's assessment that this current leadership views Iran's restrained 2020 response to the Soleimani killing as a strategic mistake, and one that invited, rather than deterred, further American pressure, gives you the actual theory of the case driving this more risk-tolerant posture. If that's genuinely the operating assumption inside Iran's newly reshuffled leadership, that visible restraint gets punished rather than rewarded, then you'd expect exactly the kind of behavior CNN sources are describing. Deliberate prolongation of the conflict, explicit statements about waiting out Trump's political clock through the midterms, and continued resistance to the kind of quick, face-saving resolution that earlier, less risk-tolerant Iranian leadership might have pursued. I want to spend real time on Azodi's specific claim that Rezaei's elevation feeds into a strategy of ensuring Trump's political allies face defeat in the midterms, because, if accurate, that represents a genuinely sophisticated, patient strategic calculation on Iran's part, one that treats this war less as a conflict to be won or lost on the battlefield, and more as an endurance contest against the American domestic political calendar. U.S. midterm elections carry real, predictable political consequences for a sitting president's ability to sustain unpopular or costly foreign policy commitments, and a war that's already produced the kind of casualty and cost figures I've documented throughout this series. American service members killed, tens of billions of dollars in disclosed spending, interceptor stockpiles running thin, is exactly the kind of conflict that becomes a genuine midterm liability if it continues without a clear resolution or clear, visible American advantage. If Iran's newly elevated leadership genuinely believes prolonging this conflict without a decisive American military breakthrough increases the odds of a political shift in Washington that could produce a more conciliatory negotiating partner after the midterms, that gives you a coherent explanation for nearly every pattern I've documented across this entire series. The repeated collapse of ceasefires and diplomatic progress, the willingness to absorb sustained military pressure without capitulating, and now this specific, deliberate elevation of leadership figures explicitly associated with an endurance-focused strategy rather than a rapid resolution-focused one. That's a genuinely patient, long-horizon strategic bet. And it's worth remembering that Iran's leadership, whatever else you might say about their decision-making throughout this war, has consistently demonstrated a willingness to absorb significant short-term costs in pursuit of what they apparently believe is a more favorable long-term negotiating position, Exactly the kind of calculation you'd expect from a leadership genuinely committed to outlasting, rather than outfighting a militarily superior adversary. I think the CENTCOM email is the single most revealing document in this entire update, more than any public statement from either government. When the actual war planning apparatus is explicitly asking its own analysts for unconventional options, that tells you the standard playbook, the one I've documented across dozens of strikes throughout this series, isn't seen internally as sufficient to change Iran's calculus. Combine that with a newly elevated, explicitly more risk-tolerant Iranian leadership under Reza-e, and a diplomatic track that's now stuck on dueling compensation demands, and I think the trajectory here points toward escalation rather than resolution, regardless of how the Hormuz talks I covered in my last two videos eventually play out. I also think it's worth stepping back and recognizing what this specific combination of developments, the unconventional pressure request, the operational security crackdown, the compensation standoff, and the Reza elevation, tells you about where both sides genuinely believe this war is headed, as opposed to where either government's public rhetoric suggests it's headed. Public statements from both Washington and Tehran have continued alternating between conciliatory and confrontational language throughout this entire war. Exactly the pattern I've documented across dozens of videos now. But the actual internal signals, an intelligence branch quietly soliciting new pressure ideas, a military tightening operational security in anticipation of continued attacks, a leadership reshuffle explicitly built around endurance rather than rapid resolution, all point in a more consistent direction than the public rhetoric alone would suggest. I think that internal consistency, even more than any single dramatic headline, is the most reliable signal available right now for where this conflict is actually heading over the coming weeks, and it's exactly why I wanted to walk through all of these threads together in a single video, rather than treating them as isolated stories. So that's where this stands, CENTCOM, quietly soliciting unconventional ways to pressure Iran. Trump adding a new compensation condition, right, as Hormuz talks were showing promise. A newly elevated Iranian leadership that reporting suggests is deliberately playing for time and a genuine operational security crackdown reflecting a military bracing for a longer fight, rather than an imminent resolution. Every thread in this update points the same direction, and I think that consistency matters more than any single piece of it in isolation. I'll keep tracking this closely, especially watching for any further reporting on what specific ideas actually came back in response to that CENTCOM request, and whether the compensation standoff I described shows any sign of softening on either side in the coming days. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.